Morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a moment or two to let people log on. So welcome. Nice of you guys to join us on a Saturday morning. I promise you it'll be worth it. For those who just joined us, morning, everyone. Thanks. Welcome. We're just going to give it a moment to let a couple of people in who I believe are still in the waiting room. So just going to give it a moment or two before we begin. Right. I think we're we're at 5 past. I think we should make our way in and begin. So if you guys don't mind, I think let's kick off. I'm Ibrahim Fakir. As you might have seen on the flyer, I do look the same in the picture and now on the screen. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us on the Saturday morning. Similar numbers to what we had last week, well, 2 weeks ago, a little bit less. It is voter registration weekend, as you all well know. I hope many of you are going to go out and register if you haven't already, but I know that you're all good citizens and you're all already registered to vote. Just make sure that you're registered in the place where you want to vote. Seems as if there might be regulation which doesn't allow you to vote anywhere in the province where you are, which used to be the case previously. But nevertheless, I said let's get going. So morning and welcome again. This is a series of webinars which are happening over a period of 2 months. There'll be 8 to 9 seminars in all across the theme of democratic developmentalism or developmental democracy. That is not about the development solely of democracy, but the development of the economy and society in general. It's been led by John Mattison. I will serve as a facilitator and interlocutor. A couple house rules before we go ahead. The first is that you'll notice that you're all muted. That doesn't mean that we would not like participation. We would like interjections. We would like participation. We would like questions. But everyone's muted for the simple reason of sifting out background noise and in case people's vacuum cleaners go off or alarms ring, or they talk inadvertently in the background, unbeknownst to them that they're actually not on mute and so on. So it's just to sift out background noise. If you wish to interject, and John and I both welcome those interjections, feel free to either raise your hand and you'll get an opportunity to speak in between, even if it's a point of clarity or order or something you want to say. Alternatively, use the chat function. There are a team kindly from Defend Our Democracy, and thanks Defend Our Democracy for both initiating and facilitating this webinar series. There's a team and myself who will be watching the chat, and so we will certainly pose your question or your comment and so on. So that's just by way of house rules. There's no strict order or anything of that sort, but as I say, feel free to interject and so on. Our webinar leader is John Mattison, who I'm sure many of you do know, but just as a quick introduction, John is a veteran South African journalist, author, has been a policy consultant, and has worked extensively in the media, but also in government. He began his career at the then anti-apartheid Rand Daily Mail. He was declared a security risk at some stage. He was given a sentence and a fine and refused entry to parliament at the time because he reported on the famous Muldergate and then refused to disclose his sources as the apartheid state then wanted him to do. After that, he spent a couple of years in Washington as a foreign correspondent and then returned to South Africa representing National Public Radio, which is the kind of public broadcaster in the US. One of John's claims to fame is that he assisted and prepared President Mandela when he was released from prison to deal with media interviews and appear on television and do radio slots and so on. And before that, he took up a research fellowship at the University of Chicago, where he kind of studied development and did a bit of work on comparative development, studying the cases of Japan in particular and Russia, which is something we will chat about later on. He's worked in the Mandela government for a while. He chaired he was on the United Nations, working for and worked at the board of the SABC. He was in the Independent Broadcast Authorities Council and chair of policy there. Drove development in radio and television. Obviously, those are both sectors which are still thriving in South Africa. He worked in Afghanistan as well at the United Nations Development Program. And has obviously, as you know, had a long and fruitful career. He's written 2 books. The first, which dealt with God, Spies and Lies, that's what it was titled, looking at South Africa's future through exploring the past. A second one, which deals with the themes that we cover in this seminar, which is called Cyril's Choices, an Agenda for Reform, that was out in 2019. And I'm sure many of you would like to have a look at it. So that's John. Welcome, John, and thanks again for doing the webinars on behalf and for Defend Our Democracy. And thanks again, Defend Our Democracy, for facilitating these. I want to kick off first, John, with a few prefatory questions before you get into the meat of today's, which is looking at lessons from Japan and China, respectively. But, last week we spoke about democracy, we spoke about development, and we concluded on a note in which you said we don't necessarily want developmental, which is driven by authoritarian government and so on. That we want to look at we want to maintain the democratic ethos, but have speeded up development, if I'm correct. That was the conclusion. And we spoke a lot about the state performance, government performance, and so on. And the thing I wanted to pick up on, and it might have some bearing on today's lessons from China and Japan, is that we talked a lot about government performance and state capacity, but we didn't really talk about the role of the private sector and how the private sector kind of plays a role in ensuring development with government. And I'm sure you're going to touch on these when you talk about Japan and China, but if you want to just kick off on that particular question.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ibrahim. Good morning, everyone. I see we have a very interesting crowd here this morning. I hope you'll have a chance to pick up the last link. This is part of a series where we're really trying to look at what we can do in next year to really change policy all round in South Africa. So it's obviously we started with the growth issue, which I think Ibrahim's going to ask me about. So let's go straight into the democracy issue. Someone raised the question last week time, whether it isn't true that all the successful rapid development states have been authoritarian or anti-democratic. And of course, that's an awkward question because there is truth in it that a dictator can move faster than a democratic government. But I am optimistic for a number of reasons. First of all, one of the people I'm going to recommend you read is a developmental economist called Stefan Durkheim. And he's done most of his field research in Africa, but also other countries. He was also chief economist in DFID in the British government. And he is confident from all his work, which we're going to discuss a little bit more today, that it can be done in democracies. In some ways, it is harder for all the obvious reasons. But the other reason I'm optimistic is that South Africa has so many great opportunities. We have by far the best opportunities of any country I can think of, certainly in Africa, and even on a global level. We have to make a lot of changes in our mindsets, but it's doable, and the opportunities are really there and relatively not that difficult to attain, at least not intellectually. Politically, they're difficult. It requires political will, and we haven't seen enough political will so far. So I think it can be. And it is done in some democracies or relative democracies. Japan is sort of is a democracy, but it has a very strong bureaucracy, especially when it started, and the bureaucracy was very powerful. That helps. And so there are other features which we'll go into during the discussion. But maybe I'll stop there for the
moment. Just picking up, John, because I'm sure you'll pick up some of these questions around Japan and its development, at least of the bureaucratic interface, when it started being a developmental state or society. But the second question was about growth. Is growth absolutely vital? Or because there is some literature which is now suggesting that you can actually have some redistribution without growth. Is that anathema? Is that just weirdness?
Yeah, so you're asking about growth. There's also been a book out this year, a South African book out that said we shouldn't have growth. Growth has become the problem. And my answer to that is really simple. In South Africa, you have we're sitting on a volcano, an unexploded, unspurned volcano of job problems, and to create the hundreds of thousands, even millions of jobs that we need to create. I just simply have no doubt you cannot do it without growth. I just saw someone responded to me my comment about Japan. Japan is a democracy, but if you read further into it, the bureaucracy often acts rather independently of the politicians. That's all I meant. But it is a democracy, and it has been since the 50s.
One of the things, John, also is, you mentioned the book. There were two that you mentioned. One, which was the one which argued about there shouldn't be growth in South Africa or whatever, or that some kind of redistribution is possible without growth. Which one is that, if you might suggest the title? And then there's the other one on development.
I can't remember the name of the one. It's by a South African. I disagreed with it vehemently. Because there is the argument that growth is the problem for obviously climate change and environmental reasons, and we could debate that separately on a global level. But for South Africa, with the crisis we have over jobs, I have no doubt in my mind that without growth, there's no way you can produce the kind of job creation that we need. The book I mentioned, I'll come back to it. It's by Stefan Durkheim, and it's called Gambling on Development. And I'll talk about it a little bit during the course of discussion today. But that's one I would recommend.
Hey, we'll also put those in the chat, so not to worry, we'll put those in the chat. John, lastly, before you kick off on today's main theme, and perhaps this might lead in, last week, one of the things you identified in the National Development Plan is you said there were 49 priorities. And one of the quicker ways of development is isolating a few to make those the main or the primary priorities. And someone posed a question last week, which we didn't get to, but I thought we might get to today, and it might lead into today's theme, is shouldn't education be that apex or the priority, the apex priority, if you want to stress the emphasis? And we've got poor outcomes in that regard, even though relative to other areas of public spending, it's probably one of the highest sort of areas in which there is public spending, yet the outcomes are not commensurate to the kind of resources which are put in. So is education the way to both growth and development?
Right. Well, actually, Ibrahim, there were 181 priorities in the NDP. And I said last time that if you have 181 priorities, you have no priorities. And that bureaucracies, as I've seen them work in Washington and everywhere else, work here in the same way. They protect themselves. If you create 181 priorities, what from my interviews with bureaucrats in South Africa tells me is what they do is they keep their departments doing what they were doing, but they just attach different NDP priorities to targets to different line items in the budget. So nothing really changes because you're not monitoring it, and that's why I recommend, and from what I've read, one recommends get no more than a handful of priorities, and then you've got to drive them as if there's no tomorrow. Now, as to your point about education, yes, someone raised that last time and said, shouldn't education be the higher priority? And my answer to that is that we're going to have a session on education. There are many things that can be done in education, but if it's implied by that education is, if you want to get a better job, you get a better education, and if that means that the country gets better educated, the economy will get better. Well, if that were true, Zimbabwe would have been booming, and it didn't boom, at least not after the first couple of years of independence. And Zimbabwe's education levels were particularly high, and yet it didn't boom. So really, I'm saying the priority comes from things, some of which are politically challenging, but intellectually not that complicated or challenging. But if you have to get them right. And if you don't, you have what's happened in Zimbabwe, because you may or may not know that education quality in Zimbabwe has now declined a great deal in the last decade or two. And so effectively what you've had is, if you don't get growth, don't get good jobs, it ends up leading education downwards rather than education leading jobs and growth upwards.
Right. So, I mean, if comparatively that was the case, right? What then to lead into today's kind of main theme, and perhaps you kick off now with what did they do in China and Japan, which distinguished them from other paths of development, or as you alluded, you might want to talk about a couple African cases in which there was fast-track development as well. So, John, how did they do this? What was their point of inception, or the point at which they started on the upward trajectory?
Yeah. All right. Well, look, I think I'm going to start on Japan, and then we'll come later to China, and Russia comes into it a little bit more. after that, and then we'll go into the African examples where we could really learn some good lessons. I mentioned last time that my guru on Japan is this book, Michi, the Japanese Miracle by the Growth of Industrial Policy 1925 to 75 by Chalmers Johnson. I must say I've reread it and it's not that accessible. So I'm going to recommend some books that might be more accessible to people, including the Durkheim book, which I mentioned earlier. But why Chalmers Johnson is so important, and I studied him and I met him and I interviewed him, is because he was the one who discovered, when I got to the University of Chicago in 1991, American media were full of the idea that Japan was the next growth country, the next superpower. It was going to overtake America, which of course it didn't. Much like they're saying about China now, and there are differences, but just for the moment on Japan. And they said it was because Japan was a free market economy. And of course, there are many free market economies, so that didn't explain why Japan particularly did utterly remarkably well. It really was the miracle country, as you see, is titled The Japanese Miracle. And what Chalmers Johnson did, he was a guy who started off as Republican. I'll just do this very briefly because we did mention it last time. Landed up in Japan at the end of World War II, learned Japanese, went back, there was at University of Berkeley, at Berkeley, and he started studying the Japanese process, and he became the guru because he discovered that the key to Japanese success was state intervention of a particular type, and he used the example of MITI. This is the title, MITI. You can see it. MITI is the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, and what he was able to show was that MITI had a giant role in the process of the rapid growth, the turbocharged growth that Japan had. And so the state's role was crucial. But the key thing that I learned that was relevant for us, and it links to the idea of social compacts, which I know you've wondered about quite a bit, Ibrahim, is that the key thing is that neither the state nor the private sector must be overwhelmingly dominant over the other. In the, let me just check the dates on this. In the 1940s, the state was overwhelmed, after the war, the state was overwhelmingly powerful. And in that time, the economy didn't do particularly well. And as Chalmers Johnson explains it, likewise, in the early 70s, the private sector got so powerful, it was able to dominate the state. And again, that was bad for economic growth. And so his conclusion is that you need a relative parity of power because it forces both sides to listen to each other as well as talking to each other. And what that leads to is what they came to call market-conforming public interested policy. In other words, the state representatives come to the meeting and they say, well, this is what's good for the country. And the private sector says, well, if you do it that way, we can't make it work. We're not going to invest in it. But if you do it this way, we can. And that's how you get an outcome. And that relates to your point about social compacts. One of the reasons our social compact system doesn't reap the results that we trumpet for it, and even they can't even get to agree, is because when you're trying to make an agreement on a national level, you're dealing with big business associations. And essentially, the government is asking them to commit to invest in return for whatever. But business associations don't take investment decisions. People don't invest in South Africa Inc. They invest in a sector where they see potential. And so actually what we found, the literature really talks a lot about, is But what you really want is sectoral compacts. And I know the government has got towards that to some degree now. They're talking about sectoral compacts. In other words, take mining, take the information economy, any of these things, agriculture. But even there, I think you've got to have a relative equality of power to get a result that both sides can live with. In other words, market conforming, but in the interests of the nation. And as I say, when the state is too powerful, it issues orders. That seems to me the problem with, government has had a policy, I think since the early 90s, of mineral beneficiation. And I've talked to the Minerals Council, and everything the impression I get is that it never happens. Well, why doesn't it happen? Because the business say it's not workable for us. And I won't go into the reasons why now. We'll discuss that the next session a little bit, perhaps. But if both sides aren't in the game and having been listened to, they won't invest. And likewise, if the private sector is too powerful, what you find happens is that they want what's in their interest. And what's interest of private sector, the big players, is usually monopoly. They don't want competition. They want whatever it is that's going to be best for them. And that's not what's best for the country. So what's best for the country is competition, in healthy competition. And you'll find that the Japanese figured that out. Now, of course, what Japan did is they started with textiles, moved into light manufacturing, towards heavy manufacturing. Its industrial expansion made it a world leader in shipbuilding, electronics, precision optical equipment, all of these things in the end. But the most useful lesson I learned really was this notion of equality. Now, they were aided by a lot of things that happened at the time. And this is my point. The fact that Japan and to extent the other Asian economies grew in a relatively similar way, starting with textiles and clothing and and simple manufacturing, and steadily went up the value chain, is a good way, and it's an easy way, and it doesn't. It's harder now. I don't see South Africa get going good answers from them, because what you find is that there are different opportunities now, and the opportunities that were there then. It wasn't just that Japan had a lot of poor people who were ready to do the work. They were also lucky, or they learned that the Korean War was starting. This is early 50s, and they started to supply clothing or uniforms to the American military. And that was a very big boost to their clothing sector. They also started supplying other things. They were then aided by the fact that as America got deeper into the Cold War, they realized that they wanted a strong democratic Japan, because a strong democratic Japan would be a bulwark against communism. And so they also bent rules to make it easier for Japan to make a big success. But the state's role was crucial, and it was and they were very aware of these issues, and they took advantage of them wherever they could. Now, the other thing, of course, is, and this is another book I want to recommend for anyone who wants to understand the sort of theoretical notions, but they're easy to read. For me, one of the best books I've ever read, and I refer to it in my own book, Cyril's Choices, is called How Rich Countries Got Rich and Why Poor Countries Stayed Poor. And he takes, it's by an academic by the name of Eric Reinhardt. I'll show you the book. And why this is enormously important is because he shows the real relationship between state and business everywhere in the world, and the real attitude to free trade versus protectionism. And what he argues, and I think there's a lot, there are many others now arguing it, and I think the World Bank has recognized some of the errors of its ways over the last 30 years. it's becoming more and more accepted that when you really want rapid growth, a certain amount of protectionism, what you might call economic nationalism, is very good for you. Of course, the more powerful a country you are, the more you want free trade. And free trade tends to benefit the powerful a lot more than the less powerful. And that's obviously an oversimplification. But to give you an idea of how deeply the Japanese bureaucrats are imbued with this national spirit, I don't think it'll surprise you. I want to just give you an idea of the mindset of the MITI public servant by telling you this story. Japan very jealously guarded its businesses. It didn't want foreign ownership, and it did many different things, financing and so on, and what they called administrative guidance rather than legislation. But they were able to put pressure on businesses to do what they wanted in many different ways. And a time came, I think it would have been in the 70s, when American car companies realized that they were losing to the Japanese car companies, and they wanted to come and buy into Japanese car companies. And the Ministry of International Trade and Industry just said no way, and they managed to block it every time. Attempts to buy Honda or shares in Honda and Toyota and others were blocked. But when they failed in one smaller case, Mitsubishi, Chrysler managed to get Mitsubishi into a shareholding deal with Mitsubishi, because Mitsubishi, for a variety of reasons, was less subject to government influence. And this is how MITI civil servants described their reaction when they heard that a foreign company had bought into a Japanese company. One civil servant said that it was like water poured into my ear while I was sleeping, or being bitten in the hand by your pet dog. And one other guy said that it's like your grown son forgetting to thank his parents for their loving care. And in this case, the parents were MITI. So people had a very protective attitude to their companies. And of course, when we come to talk about South Africa, I'm going to talk about, among other things, what's happening to our construction sector. South Africa's construction sector is in dire straits. And yet government is giving these massive contracts to Chinese firms, and that's going to have the effect that obviously, fair enough for them, it's not China's fault, it's ours. They will repatriate the profits. The profits will go back to China, and whereas if you kept the profits here, it would lead to future investment. Now, it also raises another question. I'm going to end on China now, quickly, because we want to move on. But I just want to add that you may have noticed Zongeza Zibi, who's doing very interesting things. But in his book Manifesto, he talks about abolishing the Department of Trade and Industry. And obviously, someone who reads MITI and the Japanese Miracle does not agree with that. I think we could talk further about why DTI. We talked last week about how the developmental state in South Africa, it's hard to figure out what it is. It's not obviously welfare issues like the social grant or a universal basic income grant or the NHI, National Health Insurance. Those are all good things if they can be made to work. But they're primarily welfare. The one thing that is a developmental state-oriented policy is what trade and industry tries to do. But in the talk next week, I'll talk to you about why that's inevitably inadequate, because it's not based on a global evaluation of the whole of the South African economy and where the really low-hanging fruit is. And although DTI does some very good work, I don't think they're working in any of the big industries, largely because they don't fall under DTI, and so they have to do what they can with what they have. I'll stop there because I'm next going to go on to China and why Deng Xiaoping, the greatest economic reformer in the history of the world, thought that Mikhail Gorbachev, after he met him the first time, he said Gorbachev is an idiot. But we'll come back to that in a moment. I don't know if you want to ask any questions about Japan before we move on.
Yeah, on that note of insult, not yours, John, but on on Deng's sort of note of insult, let's just pause for a moment. There's a couple interesting comments, and a range of others I've noted you, but Siva, this is a bit of an outlying question for today's seminar, but it's something we'll come to. We want John's thoughts on this idea of electoral reform, but it's not the theme of today, but we'll come to it. I mean, I get the link you're making about the fact that electoral reform might give us more accountable, more transparent, better oversight, perhaps even between institutions. But it's a slightly separate debate, and DOD and others have done a lot of work on this question of electoral reform. But Siva, we'll come to that. We're not ignoring it. It doesn't fit in with today's theme. John, there's two things I want to kick off because there are two other very interesting comments in the chat. But before I come to those in the chat, I just want to ask you about this thing. You're talking about Japan, you're talking about the protectionism, if I can sum it up in one word, in the way in which they developed their infant industries and so on. But wasn't it a different time? Less globalization, a little less integration in the world, a few different technological developments and so on. So it's a different period in history. Can South Africa afford that kind of protectionism in the current phase of where we are in world history?
I'm glad you asked that, or someone asked that question, because we're in a period of deglobalization. The globalization that happened is now retreating. And because we have a very different crowd here, I'm going to repeat one or two things that I said last time. Well, the one particular thing is that the United States has swung the pendulum considerably in the other direction. What they're doing with the CHIPS Act and the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really about the green economy, is a massive move away from deglobalization. And it's what the meeting this week between Chinese President Xi and American President Biden was all about, because that is hurting China. China has really suffered from the results of those two pieces of legislation, which have for the first time in, I think, 40 years, led the United States economy to come out ahead in growth of China's. Now, that may not last, of course, but still, that's a big enough number to be noteworthy. So it can be done. And I think I would say, in fact, in the opposite of it, it's really unfortunate that South Africa came to democracy in 1994 at a time where globalization and free trade was at the height of its powers. And I'm not anti-free trade, and I'm not anti-globalization in principle, but what Reinhart tells you in this book is that every economy that has turbocharged rapid growth in the history of the world, going back to the Italian city-states, Britain leading up to the Industrial Revolution, America under Alexander Hamilton in the first years of the United States, all the way to Japan, to Germany, to obviously all the Asian tigers in China. They've all grown by being fiercely protectionist. And the other point, which all the literature makes, as far as I can see, is that if you want rapid growth, manufacturing has got to be a key part of it. And I won't go into all the reasons why, but there are many reasons why manufacturing has a greater potential for producing rapid growth through productivity increases, shared insights across manufacturing companies. All sorts of things make manufacturing incredibly important. And in its infancy, manufacturing sometimes needs protectionism. And so I'm certainly not against total protectionism. And in fact, I want to, since you've asked the question, I want to give you an example. The great theorist of free trade was Ricardo. And he said that if one country his theory was, if one country produces oranges cheaply and another country produces apples more cheaply, rather let them specialize in apples and oranges, because between them, they'll be able to exchange, and both countries will have more apples and oranges. That's the theory of free trade, a competitive advantage. But the point Reinhard makes, and I think it's obvious once you think about it, is what if my country is can very cheaply make stones, dig them up and sell them, and your country is very good at manufacturing electronics. In 20 years' time, the country making stones will still be poor, and the country manufacturing electronics will be rich. So what you're doing is the stone country is specializing in being poor. So I think that's just rather important to understand. I'm not a total protectionist, obviously, but there are areas where it's absolutely appropriate to protect yourself. And in fact, even the Industrial Revolution, Reinhard, in Britain was the ground for it was laid in the time of Henry VII and others, who first stopped put a tax on the export of raw wool and a tax on the import of finished clothing in England, and that spurred the growth of the wool textiles, and that and other policies gave Britain the advantage, which was very timeless in terms of the rise of the Industrial Revolution. So that's perhaps enough on that for now. But the idea, but other countries are going for more protectionism. The idea that we're a free trade economy world is it's never been entirely true. I lived in Washington and I noticed how, and I've had this conversation with one or two American ambassadors out here, but I must say I've had the grace to be embarrassed when they talk about free trade, and then you say, but what about you subsidizing farmers and subsidizing steel? And one said to me, oh, you've got me there. Because they have a strong farming lobby, and they have a steel lobby, and they protect those things, and they're going to keep protecting them while they preach free trade.
Well, a rare note of embarrassment from an American, and especially an American.
It was in private.
Okay. Well, I think the current one was labeled a rogue ambassador by someone here. The current US ambassador, that is. John, there's a couple of very interesting comments in the chat, and I'm going to perhaps ask one or two of them to actually verbalize it. The one quickly, if we can be brief, is well, okay. Before I do that, there's a comment from Herman, says that you created this sort of equilibrium or balance between the private sector and the state. You don't want one which is too strong. And he's saying, isn't there a third leg? And that third leg is the civil society. What about civil society? So if you just address that shortly, and then I'm going to ask Michael Sachs, who has a couple comments. First is about the periodization and the time at which Japan became developmental. And the second is about the role of TTI, and then there's a related comment from Smatskun Ngonyama, which is about economic diplomacy and the way in which economic diplomacy might have played a role. But Rolf, if you want to just quickly unmute yourself before Michael comes in to make a couple of comments. Rolf was talking about economic development and entrepreneurship. Rolf Pretorius.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, let me somewhere put myself on video also.
Yeah, please try and be brief because we want to move on to China.
Okay. What I am really trying to say is that if one unnecessarily limits the creative freedom of the people of the country to start to do in the economy what they want, then what you're actually doing is you are also stifling the potential of the country to develop itself, because of course it's not the government that develops the country, it's the people themselves. So the government must not necessarily get in the way of the people of the country. It's only when there are a certain certain things that are necessary, such as when people are interfering with others' human rights and so on. But apart from that, the government must actually stay in the background, because then the creative potential of the population gets maximized. According to me, that's actually what happened in the People's Republic of China, because what Deng Xiaoping did is by allowing private property, he actually set a thing in motion, which actually allowed in later decades, people started to do just what they liked. But this growth now seems to be stifled, because the Xi government is now actually clamping down on that. They're trying to interfere more and more. That's the way I have. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I want.
Thanks very much, Rolf. I think I won't answer that now, because we're going to go on to China, and I'll answer it in that discussion, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, it's okay.
Should we go to Michael?
Sure, we'll come back to that. Let's just Smuts had two questions, I think. Smuts, if you want to, if it can be unmuted and quickly. I mean, the one is more a comment, and the other question. But Smuts, if you want to quickly just verbalize, if you can.
No, thank you very much, Fak. And thank you, John. Long time. And I just want to raise one issue, the question of the economic diplomacy. If you can actually maybe explain a bit whether was there any special relations between Japan, for instance, with America and the European countries, which led to Japan being favored, and so that they come up with the catch-up that they came up with. And currently, and that kind of economic diplomacy, the role of it regarding South Africa. The last one is on import substitution. Did Japan actually embark on this import substitution strategy as well? And basically, those are the two issues that I would like to raise. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Smuts. Good to see you after a long time. Okay, firstly on economic diplomacy, there's no doubt that the US wanted Japan to grow as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. So there was economic diplomacy. Diplomacy was very favorable. But my point is that that those things will ebb and flow, and we'll talk about them a little bit more when we come to foreign policy in a couple of I think that's in January. But for the moment, I would just say that don't underestimate the role of the state in facilitating things, and I'll say more about that in terms of Rolf's question a little bit later, because what the state has to be alive to is this changing environment. Where are the economic diplomacy opportunities, and where are they shifting? Because things keep changing, and we have to have the more informed our state is, the better it is able to take advantage of them. On your second point, the Japanese, I'm just going back in my mind because the Korean model, in a way, is more in my head, to be explicit, on this question of import substitution. Many developmental states have been involved in import substitution with some success. But I do remember recently reading a book on the Korean experience. And they found, and I think this is true of Japan as well, but my memory may be playing tricks on me. And that is that they found that the more healthy growth policy is export-oriented. In other words, rather than keeping out imports, which has good effects because it helps you grow, but it has bad effects in that it protects you from competition. Whereas the better policy is if you encourage exports and even incentivize maybe with tax benefits or other kinds of benefits or tax rebates or whatever to encourage exports, that in the long run is better for economic growth because it encourages your domestic manufacturers and companies to be competitive in the international environment. So between import substitution and export support, what I've read tends to favor export support.
Michael, are you around? Professor Sachs? I don't know if Michael is around. He might have a bad connection, but
I can try, Ibrahim. I have a very bad connection, so just cut me off if it.
Sounds good.
So just cut me off if it goes bad. But yeah, the point I made in the chat was that Japan became a developmental state, an effective state in many respects, during a period we could call dictatorship for the 60 years before the Second World War. And then after the Second World War, was created as a democracy by American occupation. And it was there, and these policies of export promotion, which I think is absolutely right. It's not protectionism that is important. If protection needs to be used to promote exports, let it be used. But it is one tool in export promotion. If it's simply protecting the domestic market from foreign competition for its own sake, it might not work. Then the second point is that after the Second World War, I mean, South Africa, you could also say it has done the same. In the period from 1920 to 1970, let's say, it implemented these policies of protectionist export promoting industrialization. And also, like Japan, later on, after that a process had entered into a phase of crisis. So Japan's process entered into a phase of crisis, which it still hasn't managed to resolve. Ours entered a state of crisis in the 70s, and we still haven't managed to resolve that. So I think that's important historical context, that are we planning to repeat what we've already done or do something different? And then lastly, I think in order to achieve transformation of industrial structure, right now the critical departments are energy department, maybe minerals, telecommunications and regulation of data services, and transport, which presides over SAA and Transnet and PRASA. Those are the departments that are important for industrial policy, really, not DTI, unless DTI can get its act together, maybe.
Thanks, Michael. Right, John.
Thanks, Michael. Just thanks for those points. They're really terrific. Just on the last point, I mean, it's not just DTI that has to get its act together. Communications and mining, I think you're exactly right about energy, mining, and telecommunications. But those departments need a lot of work to get their act together too. Let's go back to the beginning of your questions. I'll deal with them briefly. Of course, you're right. In fact, the Japanese success goes back way further. In 1868, there was the Meiji Restoration. It was led by the bureaucrats who decided, with the ascendancy of the new emperor, to elevate the importance of the emperor in the public mind. They went on a PR campaign, and they set out to industrialize and to modernize. And they sent teams of people all over the world. And I mean, it's a fascinating story. I wish I had time to tell more of it. And that continued, as you say, through the 20s and 30s, prior to World War II. So, of course, it's true that Japan, as we'll say with China too, had a much more sophisticated bureaucracy, which had worked under an authoritarian leadership. That leads me to another point, which I'll come back to later from Turkon, which is that of key importance, absolutely critical importance, before you decide on the state doing anything, that you have to have a good appreciation of the capability of your state. And I think that's crucial, and that's our problem here. So, for instance, you have someone in government suggesting we need to start a second ESCOM. Well, of course, that rule I've just given would rule it out completely. In other words, anybody who's a developmental person would say to you, when you run the first ESCOM properly, then they come back and we'll talk. But until you can run one ESCOM, don't expect us to agree to you having two. And the same would apply in many, many areas. But it does raise the point, which I'll come back to next time, which is the areas you've talked about: telecommunications, mining, transport, energy. I would add agriculture, although it's a bit harder there. There are ways to do it. Some of those things can be done without the capability increasing as much as we'd like it to. So it's not impossible. And then I want to just say, I want to make 2 quick points and then we'll move on. The one is that besides understanding the capability of your state, it's really essential to have a good grasp of global trends and what global trends are work for you. As we've seen in Japan, they took advantage of the Korean War and the Cold War and so on. But those opportunities are not there for us in South Africa now, but there are other ones, and we'll come back to those. And then the final point was your point about the Japanese crisis. I want to say something about that. I saw an American this week on a YouTube clip saying, well, you see, the Japanese claimed they had MITI and it was such a big deal, but it really wasn't. Look at them now, they're a mess. But that's partly true, but also very misleading. First of all, the fact that MITI and the state were a great success until 1989 or so, I think is irrefutable. The question is, and this is always a question with bureaucracies, as you, Michael, will know better than I do, is you get entrenched bureaucracies, and there's always the danger that they become institutionalized and sclerotic and unable to adapt. So the fact that Japan did so well until the late 80s doesn't mean, still stands, even if how they've done after that is not so good. But I want to make another quick point about Japan. First of all, Japan has a major demographic crisis. It's an aging population. And given that they also have some other economic problems and structural problems that they haven't resolved, they've actually done extremely well. I mean, it's still what, 3rd or 4th biggest economy in the world, and it's a tiny bunch of islands with very few resources. So I don't dismiss Japan even now when it's not growing much, but its people are living a pretty good life despite everything. And actually, when we talk about China, it's not clear that China will manage its demographic and other problems quite as well. So I don't see Japan as a failure just because it's not growing anymore. It's still most countries would envy their performance. Ibrahim, should we? Is there anything more, or should we move on to China?
No, there's a couple comments, but I think we can. You will be addressing those as you address China. So I think we should go on to China now.
Okay.
I think we addressed the Japanese question.
Okay.
But interesting point is kind of protectionism for export, not protectionism for protectionism's sake, so to speak. But nevertheless, we'll come to those issues. So go ahead on China, John.
Yeah, well, just a quick point on is protectionism only for export. If you have an infant industry, it can often be totally necessary to give it some protection in the early years before it's doing exports. But I think that requires a capable state that is able to monitor and evaluate in an independent way that isn't captured by some kind of state capture. But let me move on. In the 1980s, China and Russia and the Soviet Union were both at a crossroads. China could see what Japan had achieved, Singapore and others, and the leader, Deng Xiaoping, was I call the greatest economic reformer in the history of the world, had meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union. After their meeting, their paths diverged, and Deng said he thought Gorbachev was an idiot. We know this from Deng's son, Deng Zhibang, who tells us this. And again, in a lot of the American media, which I follow a lot because I live there, a lot of the explanation is that a lot of the discussion revolves correctly around the fact that Gorbachev chose political reform first and economic second, whereas Deng Xiaoping in China chose economic reform at the expense of political reform. And that has made all the difference. We know, of course, that South Africa chose political reform before economic reform. But what the other issue that Deng found wrong about Gorbachev, which doesn't get as much attention, was he said, don't privatize everything overnight. Don't throw away your businesses. However poorly functioning they are as state businesses, they are your businesses, they're assets. Start moving. It's a kind of gradualism as well as haste. Start growing new shoots, including private sector. I mean, for instance, as I think Rolf mentioned, he started off by doing in China was to say to agriculture, you must continue providing to the state what you were providing, but anything above that you can sell off and keep the profits. And that was the first step. And he moved step by step towards more and more private activity. But he didn't kill off the factories and the big companies that China had that were state-owned under the Communist Party. And that was a key difference. What the Russians did, and this is really something I studied. I went to Russia on a study tour with the University of Chicago in '92. And one of the books I want to show you is this one. It's called Sale of the Century, and it's by Chrystia Freeland. What's interesting about her, this is not a new book, but she is now the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and the Finance Minister. And after she wrote this book, she went into government. She became the Foreign Minister then, and now she's the Deputy Prime Minister. She's quite a brilliant woman, and what she shows in this book is how the whole of Russia was sold off. Russia's great economy, and eventually landed up in the hands of about 20 oligarchs. And what they had done was they took advice from a lot of American economists, including from Chicago, but more from Harvard. And they were advised to have shock therapy, exactly the opposite of what Deng Xiaoping did. They were told, sell it all off quickly. Now, there were other reasons why they did it. And the Russian economists in government under Yeltsin knew that they were going to lead to more corruption, but they thought it was worth it because they were worried that in the 1996 election the communists could come back, and then they would change everything forever. And so they wanted to privatize rapidly, so that whatever happened in the 96 election, which eventually Yeltsin actually won, to a lot of people's great surprise, they wanted to privatize very quickly, so that it would be done and dusted and couldn't be undone. And so they went for a process they knew was corrupt, but they thought that by doing it, they would benefit in the long run because they might be corrupt in the beginning, but they'll settle down and become good businesses. But there was something else that happened at the same time, and that was that they took the advice of Western economists to free the capital markets, which effectively meant that these oligarchs could steal all this money, and then they could export it just to countries where there was a better rule of law than Russia, because Russia didn't have a good rule of law. And I saw this when I was in Russia in 1992, because there were different company laws in Moscow than there were in St. Petersburg, and it was just a real pea soup, the legal system there. So the consequence of that was that living standards in Russia fell 25 to 30% on average, 2.5 to 3 million, these are conservative figures, excess deaths in those 10 years, deaths of hunger and despair. Russia went through an absolutely shocking time in the 90s. And of course, this was the Russia that Vladimir Putin inherited in late 99. And what people didn't realize was that everything in Russia revolves around the oil price. If you want to understand the popularity of leaders of Russia from Gorbachev onwards, look at the oil price. Because as the real reason the Soviet Union fell, as far as I'm concerned, Ronald Reagan had a role and so on, but was that the command economy, a state-led economy, could not keep up with the technological change of industries. And so they became more and more dependent on the price of oil. And Gorbachev was briefed about this. There were some economists who saw it coming, and he took that seriously. But his methods turned out to be, from an economic point of view, pretty disastrous. But the result was that Russia went into a really terrible time. But a few months before Putin took office, the oil price started to rise. And it rose all the way from 1999 to about 2014. And of course, those were the years that Putin was very popular. As you may or may not know, Putin's wrote a thesis while he was unemployed only a few years earlier, in which he said the way for Russia to recover its glory was through using its energy powers, oil and gas, and later nuclear, as we now know through the Zuma deal, as a way of building both economic and geostrategic strength back in the world. So he focused on that. And it was successful as far as it went, but Russia's never been able to recover, to build a strong non-mining, non-resource economy. And so, in fact, the baby brother, China, has become the big brother, and Russia the big brother. So get back to China. So Deng's key insight was to don't discard what you have until you've got something better. He also then later got a benefit from U.S. policy. The U.S. welcomed China into the WTO, partly based on this book, the views of the man who wrote this book, Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, and The Last Man. Because Fukuyama, and I know I'm slightly oversimplifying, he said that after the fall of the Cold War was the end of history in the sense that the future was democracies and free markets. That was the best system, and that combination would take over everywhere. Well, some of us may have noticed that history has had an unfortunate habit of rearing its ugly head recently in a couple of wars and many other things. So that was a problem, but it did lead the US to feel that it could be very generous with China, and it had ulterior motives too. It was happy to accept cheaper consumer goods, and of course China started to buy US debt. So America's economy did become intermingled with China's. But they're now having a reaction against it, and that is the sort of anti-globalization, de-risking. They first said we want to decouple. Some commentators said the US must decouple from China because now we're in a Cold War. But others said we want to not decouple, but at least de-risk. And that explains what Biden has done with the CHIPS Act. By the way, advised by Marianne Mazzucato, the economist who also advises Cyril Ramaphosa. So again, for what China did, what Deng did, he also realized agriculture was the most important thing. So he started by the things I described to help with agriculture. And then he started special economic zones, township and village enterprises, as they were called. But these economic zones were linked to an industrial policy. What are the goods we want to sell? What are the things we want to prioritize and will support in various ways? The other thing that China's done, and this might interest someone like Rolf, is the Communist Party in China gives incentives to its mayors, who are party men, to bring growth and job creation. If you want to be a mayor, if you want to stay a mayor or get promoted, you have to show you brought in investment, growth, and jobs to your town. And you are monitored in this, and your promotions and demotions depend on it. So in the the communist system of the Communist Party of China, if you want to do well, you better get growth. And getting it, by the way, getting it from foreigners is considered extremely valuable. So that's communism, what you might say, of a special type. But Yeah. So we're running low on time, so I just want to finish China fairly quickly by quoting to you from, each of the countries we talk about has a made in China or whichever country policy. China has a made in China 2025 policy. And I think you'll get a really insight into how the Chinese government thinks. The opening sentence of the Made in China 2025 says, manufacturing is the mainstay of the national economy, the mainstay on which the nation is established, an instrument of rejuvenation, and the foundation of a world power. That's pretty big. Without a strong manufacturing industry, there'll be no country and no nation. So then it talks about being a manufacturing powerhouse and unleashing a new round of competition in the manufacturing industry. And part of it, by the way, is to grow its construction sector, to create world-known Chinese brands, green manufacturing system, and its brand. And it says, let the market lead with government guidance. And I think that's exactly the point we're making. But what it also tells me is that when we give our construction work to the Chinese construction firms, we are fitting in with China's Made in China 2025 policy. Our NDP is a much longer thing. It doesn't have short-term targets, at least targets that you can hold people accountable in the time while ministers are still in office, and not their successors. And yeah. And then the last point I want to make before I end on China is that Stefan Durkon's comments as a developmental economist are often quite similar to what the Chinese say. And the reason this is explained by the reason he calls his book Gambling on Development. Deng Xiaoping said, cross the river by feeling the stones. In other words, you test things out, you do experiments, you accept failure, but you correct in real time. And that's exactly what Durkan talks about. He says you need to allow for failure, and that's why he calls his book Gambling, because when you try a development option, it doesn't always work. But you've got to be forgiving if it's a legitimate mistake, and move on and not risk too much before you do. I think I'm going to stop on China there, and perhaps we'll take a couple of questions, and then I'll finish off on Africa.
So no questions from me, but there's a comment from Herman. Herman, if perhaps Herman can be unmuted and he can pose his comments like a comment. He also had an earlier comment about the third leg, not a strong state and strong private sector balance, but a strong civil society. Herman, if you want to sum up your comments, if you can.
Yeah, I strongly believe in that theory that Professor Henry Mintzberg developed, namely rebalancing society. And one of his arguments that communism in Russia went down was not that capitalism won, but that the state became by far too powerful to the detriment of the rest of the country. And I see a similar tendency in China, with Xi now being possibly president for life, and the state becoming so overpowering that if that carries on, China will never fulfill its potential that it really has.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with you for a number of reasons. I think President Xi has really changed Chinese policy in a number of ways to strengthen his own position. He's got rid of his opponents. In fact, many of them pro Deng Xiaoping people. But also, China faces the same demographic problem, and as you know, that's that's also serious. The one-child policy has led people, the number of young people who are needed for economic growth because of the kind of work they do, that's shrinking. And since they've made it easier for people to have more children, that by and large Chinese couples don't. They've got used to having small families, and they've persisted. So the demographic decline is real, and it was first introduced to me in Washington by somebody. I didn't take it that seriously, but I know from Japan, and I think now in China, that's a real issue. It's also hamstrung by the fact that Xi has turned on certain companies, and not for developmental reasons, because there might be a developmental reason to restrain a company, I suppose, but that's not what he's doing. He's doing it at least in substantial reason for political control. So that and a couple of other things, and the fact that the meeting this week between Xi and Biden was partly caused by the fact that Biden's policies are hurting China. They may not be helping Biden as much as he'd like, but they are hurting China. And that's one reason Xi came to the table this week. So I agree with you. I think we may have lost Ibrahim, so I'm just going to carry on while we get back. I think he's trying to get back in. And I'm going to talk about Africa. Are you back?
Hello. No, John, it's Mats. I just wanted to ask.
Sorry. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Mats.
Okay. No, I wanted to say the issue that is also raised is that China's production mainly came from small factories with less than 500 workers that were monitored by city and county governments, in contrast to state-owned factories in the Soviet Union, for instance. What do you think about that within our case and as South Africa? And is that a model that we can actually emulate?
I think that we have to look at what works for South Africa. I don't think foreigners can tell us. I think it's got to be us, because we know our economies. And I'm not sure of any case like that I understand well enough to comment on. But as we're going to discuss next time, there are major areas where we can grow if government gives the commitment. And that will start with small businesses. But I mean, China has big businesses as well. And as you see, their made in China policy now is to have big global brands. So I don't think the size of the business is a decisive fact. Yeah, but we're low on time, so I think I better carry on to get through. I'm going to go through Africa very quickly because we really are low on time. But what I want to say essentially is, well, I want to tell a quick story from Durkon about, he compares his experience with the economists in the presidency in Kinshasa, DRC, with his experience with economists in the presidency in Addis Ababa. And he makes the point that in Kinshasa, they're very eloquent, they're very well spoken, well dressed. Their development programs are very articulate, very academically sound. And he walks out thinking nothing's going to happen here. Then he goes to Addis Ababa, where people are more scruffy, they're less well spoken. Some of the plans have what he considers economic mistakes. And he walks out and says, these guys are going to do the job. And the question is why? And his answer is, I think, essentially that, one of the reasons is that in Ethiopia, they have committed themselves to, it's about the attitude of the state. And of course, I want to say something about the resource curse, because the DRC has many problems, but one of them is the resource curse. And the resource curse has had the effect of making people rest on their laurels. And the best example of this is comparing SAA with Ethiopian Airlines. Ethiopian Airlines has eaten SAA's lunch. I was just looking it up this morning. Ethiopian Airlines goes to 76 African destinations. This week, they ordered 42 new jets, 31 from Boeing and 11 from Airbus. SAA now has a total of 6 active aircraft. Now, what's the difference? Both are state-owned. But in Ethiopia, they didn't have any money. They didn't have the luxury of a backstop of mining revenue. And so what they said is, we don't have the luxury to give you a bailout. We're not going to give you a bailout, but to make it work, we're not going to interfere either. And so the Ethiopian system has worked very well. They said, if you can't make a living, you're going to go under. So do your best, but we won't interfere. Ethiopia has a very active view of the developmental state. They teach it in their universities. They've applied it, starting with agriculture, improving quality of seeds and products and so on, moving into small industry, linking their industrial parks to a practical goods that really will sell, and they became the fastest growing economy in the world from 2009 to 2019. So that's an African state that was the best in the world. Of course, they're not now, and Michael could raise the same question with me there, that they're not now because, of course, a war broke out, and since that, they haven't been able to get back. The same is true to a degree in places like Rwanda and Kenya. In Kenya, they had a state capture very similar to South Africa's until about 2002. And they haven't cleaned up corruption as one would like since then. But since 2002, they started the process of setting up a developmental economic plan. They stuck to it. They've succeeded in communications areas, a whole range of them, and also that includes Wi-Fi and fintech, and in fintech they're ahead of us. So it shows that it can be done in Africa. The model needs to work, but a developmental state requires some of those things that I've discussed. We're already at 11:24. I think I'm going to stop now, so we've got a chance for some last questions. Ibrahim, you're back.
Indeed, I am. I never really left. I just switched devices. Thanks to Eskom and City Power, which in Johannesburg has got a whole new roster which actually can't be worked out. So anything that underpins regulation, as we know, only works if there's consistency, predictability, and both consistency and predictability are completely out the window. Nevertheless, there's one comment, interestingly, which is about the nature of businesses driven in African societies contra other places. But I mean, I don't know how relevant it is to modern African societies and states, and that's about the communal nature of it, John. Perhaps you might care to comment on that for a moment before we take a few others.
Well, not really. I mean, it's not something I've particularly focused on, frankly, but my work is to say that if we get our policies right, people of all kinds, businesses of all kinds, communal or otherwise, will invest and will grow. But no, it's not something I have a valid point.
Is there perhaps a kind of broader underlying question which is unstated, and that's about this clash conceptually between sort of embracing ideas of modernity or even post-modernity, post-industrial, technologically different modernity, with kind of clashes with very traditional ideas about social and political organization. Perhaps that's what's lurking behind the question. I don't know. But I mean, there's another comment from Sharda Naidu. I don't know, Sharda, if you want to unmute and perhaps pose your question in a more more formulaic way, or do you want me to just go ahead and say that, I mean, John, you can see it, is our problems the nature of policies or the nature of its implementation?
Thank you. I think that's just it, Ibrahim. When we think about it, yeah. Since the 90s, our policies, sure, we could have done with a lot of tweaking and a lot of refinement. But had we had rigor in terms of implementation and learning processes alongside the rigor, we could have been a lot further down the line. I'd appreciate your comment, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Chana. Yes, of course, that's absolutely true. The implementation, we have lots of policies that are good and that should have been implemented and weren't. And I think I mentioned last time, the Digital Commission took the decision, wrote the report on digital migration in 2002 and submitted it to the minister, and it still hasn't happened. So that's a perfect example. And you could say the same. I mean, if you look at the NDP, it says things about how we've got to get mining permit system up to date. And as we know, that was 2012. We still don't have what they call a cadastral system that enables us to deal with permits rapidly. But I want to add one point, and that is I don't want to let people off the hook by saying, oh, we've got perfect policies, we just need to do better at implementation. Because in a dynamic world we're in, you have to be dynamic. You have to keep changing your policies. That's what we sort of hinted at with Japan. So the Chinese, for instance, looking at their good side, not the bad side right at the moment, they're already planning how to shift to the next value level of providing value. And every country has to, Japan did it, China did it, Ethiopia's doing it, Rwanda's doing it. So you start off with agriculture, you get Ethiopia used its export revenues from flowers, started exporting, and so did Kenya. They started exporting millions of flowers every year, and it became a big revenue source. And they used that to import machinery to start other businesses. So the idea that we have that we can just rest on our laurels with policy bothers me. I mean, I'll tell you one other thing about my experience with this digital migration thing. I went into the SABC board in 2017, and we still didn't have digital migration. I'd been out of it for a while, so I was coming back after being in Afghanistan with the UN. And I discovered that while we failed to get digital migration done, the technology has leapfrogged. And so now there's an entirely new option that should be considered instead of what we did with set-top boxes and all of that. But people felt, well, we're not even going to raise it with government because it'll take so long and it'll cause so many clashes, and it's just not easy to engage with government. And so not much happened. But so we do have a lot of good policies. There's a lot in. I mean, the NDP says we should reduce the number of foreign embassies immediately. That was in 2012. So there's a lot that needs to be done, but we really need to have a permanent policy upgrading mentality in all our departments.
Absolutely. I mean, in reality, in some cases, our policies are also contradictorily figured in one sense that certain goals, for example, certain empowerment targets and so on, in some cases undermine actual developmental outcomes. So they might meet one metric on your evaluation of what you set up, but it undermines an actual broader social development kind of benefit. But nevertheless, these are issues I think we will come to. But good point, Shada. But I think there is one thing to think about, and it's a popular adage which says that if your policies are unimplementable, or if they're implemented with pretty poor outcomes, are they good policies in the first place? But anyway, that's something for us to think about. John, thanks very much. I think we've covered two major themes so far in the series, and we've looked at the nature of development. We've looked at the National Development Plan prioritization, why it might have failed, certain aspects of it. We've now done a little bit of comparative thinking about about the future and about comparative sort of societies. China, Japan, touched a little bit on Russia, touched a little bit on Africa. We'll pick this up. Just to announce, guys, thanks for the next seminar, which is going to be on the 29th of November. It's a Wednesday evening. Perhaps everyone's back from work, slightly more settled at home. Doesn't take up much of your Saturday. We will again try to keep it an hour and a half. And thanks everyone for participating today on a Saturday. So the next one, just to reiterate, 29th of November. It's a Wednesday evening from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. We will place it in the chat. The books that John referred to are in the chat. Thank you, everyone, again for coming. Thanks, John, for all the work you've done on kind of scheming out this series and doing 2 sterling seminars so far. We've had great participation, spirited questions, and nice discussion. Of course, we're taking it out of the populist realm, or that characterizes much of our public debate at the moment. I think we're a bit more considered, but not non-political. Thanks very much, everyone. The next link will be shared. It will be advertised in the DoD website, but also all of their social media platforms and so on. Just to remind you, Wednesday, the 29th, between 7 and 8:30 p.m. The theme, we're now going to move on. I've sketched what we've done so far. We're going to move on to look at 4 trends, 4 themes, which are emergent globally, which South Africa can take advantage of to spur job creation. So it's largely about looking at these 4 themes, 4 trends that South Africa can capitalize on, what it might mean for job creation. John, thanks. We look forward to that on the 29th. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, DoD. Thanks, Defend Our Democracy, for facilitating and doing this seminar series and for getting me to facilitate them. Thanks, everyone. Cheerio.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.